My name is Caleb Miller, 34 years old, a mechanic who signed away his life to pay his brother's debt. The seats on both sides of the aisle were empty. Not a single guest, no officiant, no family, no one to celebrate. This was a marriage made by contract. I walked that empty aisle to the end anyway. At the far end, a bride sat in a wheelchair. White dress, still hands. That was Serafina Sterling. As I approached, she looked me up and down. Slowly, quietly. "You're not Julian," she said. "No, I'm not." She wasn't surprised. She wasn't flustered. She seemed to have known from the beginning that I wasn't Julian, and that it didn't matter. She was simply waiting. That morning, Serafina's stepmother Eleanor Sterling had come to our house. The foreclosure notice was already on the kitchen table. 60 days. If we couldn't pay, my parents' home was gone. Eleanor put a contract in front of me. If I married Serafina, Julian's debt of $2.3 million would be forgiven. I read the contract. My parents' faces came to mind. My father's knee surgery, my mother's medication. 60 days. I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. I told myself I had no right to let it shake. I signed. Serafina looked at me one last time. No hope, no anger, just fact. "Everyone runs eventually," she said. "Your brother did." I signed anyway. Later, I found out the truth. 2 years ago, my brother Julian had deliberately damaged Serafina's car brakes. He wanted to frighten her into signing documents that would release her trust funds to him. The plan went wrong. There was an accident. Serafina ended up in a wheelchair. Julian ran. After that, Serafina's stepmother Eleanor took over as her legal medical proxy. Eleanor was now controlling all of Serafina's accounts and every medical decision made on her behalf. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. My bank accounts were frozen. Balance zero. I had no one I knew. No one I could trust. Inside that estate, I was completely alone. But Serafina was different. She was the one in that house who looked like she knew nothing. That's what I thought. I was wrong. Serafina already knew, far more than I did. The fog came in off the water before sunrise, the way it always did in late October, slow and deliberate, like something that had made up its mind. It rolled across the harbor, swallowed the lobster boats whole, and then climbed the hill toward Rockport without apology. By the time it reached Elm Street, it had turned the Miller house gray. Caleb stood at the kitchen window in yesterday's clothes, a mug of coffee gone cold in his hand. The fog pressed against the glass like it was curious about what was happening inside. He didn't have the heart to tell it there wasn't much to see. The kitchen table was a cartography of disaster. Final notice Central Maine Power. Final notice Rockport Savings and Trust. A letter from a law firm in Boston with the word foreclosure printed in a font designed to make the body go cold. Beneath all of it, half buried under a grocery circular advertising things his parents could no longer afford, was the HELOC statement. Home equity line of credit. $240,000. 60 days past due. Caleb set the coffee mug down on top of the power bill. It left a ring, and he stared at it for a moment like it was the most significant thing in the room. He was 34 years old. He had done 2 tours in Fallujah and 1 in Kandahar. He had held a compress against wounds that no medical training fully prepares you for and kept his hands steady doing it. He had come home to this town, to this house, to the smell of his mother's pot roast, and the sound of his father's laugh, and he had told himself that was enough. That being the quiet one was fine. That being the dependable one was a kind of dignity the world had stopped valuing, but that still meant something here, in this kitchen, in this fog. Julian had always been the one with the ideas. Caleb turned away from the window and walked down the short hallway to his brother's room. He pushed the door open without knocking, out of old habit, and then caught himself stood in the doorway with his shoulder against the frame, looking at a bed that hadn't been slept in for 9 days. Julian had left in a hurry. That much was clear. The closet door hung open. A single dress shirt still on its hanger. The rest of the rack emptied in what must have been 15 minutes of frantic packing. The nightstand drawer was open. 2 wallet-sized photo of the family Christmas 2 years ago. A gas station receipt. A pen with no cap. Small artifacts of a life abandoned mid-sentence. What hadn't been taken in the hurry was worse than the empty spaces. The 401k withdrawal notice sat on the corner of the desk, where Julian had left it, as though he'd meant to deal with it later and simply never came back for it. Caleb picked it up. Early withdrawal penalty. Federal tax withholding. The numbers meant Julian had cashed out everything, absolutely everything, and converted it to something that left no trail and followed him wherever he'd gone. The date on the notice was October 3rd, 8 days before he disappeared. Beneath the withdrawal notice was a handwritten note on the back of an envelope. It said, simply, "I'm sorry, Cal. I didn't have a choice." Caleb had read that note 6 times in the past week. Each time, he tried to find something in it that wasn't a lie. Each time, he came up empty. Julian Miller was 37 years old and had been a financial advisor for Sterling Capital Management, which was a particular kind of irony that Caleb was still too tired to fully appreciate. The Sterlings were old money, coastal Maine old money, which was its own peculiar category. The kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself because it had been in the walls of this town for 3 generations. They had a board seat at the regional hospital, a named wing at the Farnsworth Art Museum, and until very recently, a financial advisor named Julian Miller managing a portion of their family trust. Until Julian had started managing it in the wrong direction, into his own accounts, over a period of nearly 14 months. The amount, according to the letter from the Sterling family attorney that had arrived on the Miller doorstep 6 days ago, was $2.3 million. Caleb had read that figure 12 times before he believed it. He was still standing in Julian's doorway, the withdrawal notice in his hand, when he heard his mother moving in the kitchen. The soft shuffle of her slippers, the particular sound of the refrigerator opening, the pause, while she looked at what was inside and calculated, the way she'd been calculating for the past 8 months. Rosemary Miller was 63 and had been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis 2 winters ago. And the medications that kept her functional cost money that no longer existed in any reliable form, because the money that had existed had been Julian's income, which had turned out to be someone else's money. And now there was a HELOC statement on the kitchen table and a fog pressing against the windows and a son who couldn't fix this the way he'd learned to fix engines. Caleb set the withdrawal notice back on Julian's desk. He picked up the watch instead. Julian had left it on the nightstand beside the gas station receipt, a Tag Heuer, a graduation gift from their father back when Frank Miller had still been working full shifts at the boatyard and hadn't yet needed the knee replacement. The watch had been Julian's pride. He'd worn it to every client meeting, every country club dinner, every occasion he could manufacture an excuse to display it. He'd left it behind. Caleb turned it over in his hands. The metal was cold from the unheated room, and it sat heavy in his palm the way honest things do. He wasn't sure how long he stood there holding it. Long enough for the fog outside to lighten from gray to the color of old bone. Long enough for his mother to start the coffee and then go silent again. He heard the car before he saw it. A vehicle had no business being on Elm Street at 6:45 in the morning. Certainly not one that moved with that particular kind of unhurried authority, the sound of an engine that had never worried about fuel prices. Caleb crossed back to the kitchen without hurrying and looked out the window. A black Escalade with a Rockport Country Club parking sticker sat at the curb. A driver in a gray jacket stood beside it, face neutral, watching the house. The passenger door opened. Eleanor Sterling was 55 years old and dressed for a board meeting at 7 in the morning. Which told you nearly everything you needed to know about Eleanor Sterling. She wore a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse the color of old ivory. And she walked up the cracked front path of the Miller house as though she were arriving at a venue she'd agreed to inspect only as a courtesy. Rosemary Miller appeared beside Caleb at the window, a dish towel in her hands. Her voice was barely a breath. "Why is she here?" Caleb didn't answer, because he was working on that question himself. The Sterling family attorney had sent a letter. That was the established channel. That was the protocol for people like the Sterlings when dealing with situations like this one. Eleanor Sterling did not drive to Elm Street in a black Escalade at dawn. Not unless the letter hadn't achieved whatever effect she'd intended. He met her at the door before she could knock. She looked at him the way people look at a problem they're calculating how to solve. Her eyes were the particular pale blue of a winter sky, pretty, in the way that cold things can be pretty. "Caleb," she said, not a question. "Mrs. Sterling." She held out an envelope. It was cream-colored, heavyweight stock, sealed with a small sticker. Not a law firm's sticker. Her own. "I'd prefer to do this inside," she said, though her tone did not suggest she was asking. He stepped back and let her in, because his parents' mortgage was 60 days past due and Eleanor Sterling had arrived at his door at dawn. And there was a math to that situation that didn't require much calculation. She sat at the kitchen table, his father's chair, which she chose without being told it was his father's chair. And she folded her hands and looked at the room with an expression that made no particular effort to conceal what she thought of it. Frank Miller's toolbox on the counter. The stack of final notices she hadn't moved her eyes away from fast enough. The dish towel in Rosemary's hands. "Julian's debt to my family is $2.3 million, Eleanor said. She delivered the figure the way people deliver facts they've had time to make peace with. "The courts will pursue him. They'll likely find him eventually. But that's a slow process, and my daughter's situation is not slow." She opened the envelope and placed a document on the table. 3 pages, small print, a signature line at the bottom. "Julian's debt is forgiven," she said, "if a Miller son marries Serafina today." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the fog had begun to pull back from the harbor, revealing the water beneath gray and flat and patient. Caleb picked up the document. He read it. He read it again. His mother had gone completely still by the counter, the dish towel pressed against her chest. He thought about the HELOC statement. He thought about his mother's medication. He thought about his father's knee and the boatyard that had let him go at 61. And the retirement savings that had been modest to begin with and were now substantially less than modest. He set the document down. He put his hand on the table beside it, and he felt, without meaning to, the cold iron of Julian's watch still in his palm. The weight of a life his brother had walked away from without looking back. His own life, he realized, was the only currency he had left to spend. The fog continued its retreat. Somewhere down by the water, a gull called once and then went quiet. The Sterling estate sat 3 miles outside of Rockport on a promontory that had been carved by glaciers and subsequently purchased by Serafina's grandfather in 1961 for a sum that was, by current standards, embarrassingly modest. The house itself was not a house in any conventional sense, it was a structure that had been designed to communicate something. Though Caleb, riding in the back of the Escalade with Eleanor's contract folded in his jacket pocket, couldn't have said precisely what. Power, maybe, or the particular American version of permanence that wealthy families construct to reassure themselves they will outlast ordinary people. Glass and marble, that was his first impression. Glass that reflected the fog and marble that absorbed it, so the entire facade seemed both transparent and impenetrable simultaneously. The grounds were immaculate in the disciplined, humorless way of places that employ full-time staff to maintain the illusion of effortlessness. A stone fountain stood at the center of the circular drive, its water shut off for the season, the basin dry and slightly melancholy. Caleb stepped out of the car and stood for a moment with his hands loose at his sides. The way he used to stand when first entering a new fob, taking inventory. Exits, sight lines, the placement of the security cameras mounted at the corners of the estate's front face. There were 4 cameras visible from where he stood, possibly more in positions he hadn't identified yet. Eleanor moved past him toward the entrance without pausing, speaking to a man in a dark blazer who had appeared at the front door. Caleb followed, because there was nothing else to do, carrying his one bag. And the specific discomfort of a man walking into a situation he hadn't fully agreed to and couldn't fully see the edges of. They led him through a foyer with a floor that was some variety of Italian stone. He didn't know which kind, and nobody offered to tell him, and down a corridor lined with framed photographs. Sterling family portraits arranged in chronological order, their faces growing more relaxed as the photographs grew more recent, as though wealth, given enough generations, eventually convinced people they had nothing to prove. He noticed that in none of the photographs did the woman appear who must have been Serafina's mother. There was a visible gap in the chronology, several years absent from the wall. And then Eleanor appeared in the newer frames, standing with the confidence of someone who had claimed territory and redecorated. He was shown to a suite on the second floor, the guest suite. Though the man in the dark blazer called it your room, with studied neutrality, and left alone with instructions that the ceremony would take place at noon. It was not yet 8 in the morning. Caleb set his bag on the floor without unpacking it and stood in the center of the room. The ceiling was high enough to produce a faint echo. The bed was larger than his parents' living room. Through a set of French doors, a private balcony overlooked the eastern grounds, and beyond the grounds, the Atlantic today. A pewter plate under overcast sky, featureless and immense. He needed to find the bathroom, and in finding the bathroom, he needed to pass through the small sitting area adjacent to the suite, and in passing through the sitting area, he noticed the library door standing open across the hall. He told himself he was only looking. The library was the kind of room that justified the existence of the rest of the house floor-to-ceiling shelves. A fireplace that had been used recently enough to still smell of ash, leather chairs positioned in the specific configuration of people who read seriously and alone. Caleb stepped inside, not because he had any particular business there, but because the room felt, for the first time since he'd arrived, like a space that didn't require anything of him. The document was on the desk. He almost didn't notice it. It was partially covered by a leather desk pad, a corner of it visible, but the header was enough. The font, the seal, durable power of attorney Sterling Family Trust. He glanced at the open door. No sound in the corridor. He lifted the desk pad and read. It was comprehensive. That was the only word for it. Eleanor Sterling held, via a POA executed 2 years prior, full authority over Serafina Sterling's medical decisions, financial accounts, real property transactions, and trust distributions. The document was notarized and witnessed. The language was airtight. He could tell that much without a law degree. The way you can tell a well-maintained engine by the sound it makes, by the absence of vibration where there should be none. Full control. Every account, every medical decision, every distribution from a trust that Caleb estimated, based on the size of what surrounded him, represented a sum that would take the Miller family approximately 400 years to accumulate. He set the desk pad back carefully and stepped back from the desk. Does she even know I'm not Julian? The thought came out before he could organize it into anything more useful. He whispered it, barely audible, standing in a library full of other people's books. His own heartbeat was loud in his chest, a phenomenon he'd experienced in exactly 3 prior situations, none of which had taken place in a house like this one, none of which had ended simply. He left the library and returned to the corridor. He was walking back toward his suite when he noticed it approximately 30 feet from the door of what he'd been told was the bridal suite. Mounted at the junction of the wall and ceiling, angled with geometric precision toward the suite's entrance. A Ring camera, consumer grade, recognizable model, the kind of thing you'd buy to monitor a front door or a package delivery. Not the estate's integrated security system. He'd seen the nodes for that, recessed and discreet, installed by professionals. This camera was different. This camera had been added separately, after the professional installation. Someone had wanted to see who came and went from Serafina's door without that observation appearing on the estate's official system. Caleb stood in the corridor and looked at the camera, and the camera of course did not look back. But somewhere, someone was watching the footage. He made himself walk at a normal pace back to his suite. He sat on the edge of the enormous bed and put his elbows on his knees and tried to think clearly. He was 34 years old. He had no money. His accounts had been frozen as a peripheral consequence of Julian's investigation, a detail the Sterling attorney had mentioned in their letter with the bureaucratic affect of someone noting a scheduling conflict. He had a contract in his jacket pocket that he'd signed in his parents' kitchen. While his mother stood with a dish towel against her chest and didn't say a word, because there was nothing to say. He was in a glass and marble estate on the Maine coast, preparing to marry a woman he had never met, in the place of a brother who had apparently spent 14 months systematically stealing from that woman's family. He sat with that for a moment, let it take up the full space it deserved, and then he thought about the library, about the power of attorney, about the camera positioned to watch Serafina's door. He thought about the way Eleanor had said, in his parents' kitchen, "My daughter's situation is not slow. Not Serafina, not my stepdaughter. My daughter's situation, possessive, proprietary, the language of ownership rather than family." He went to the closet to find the suit that had been left for him. It was hanging there, dry cleaned, still in its plastic, a dark charcoal that probably cost more than his truck. He unzipped the plastic and looked at the label. Julian's name was written in permanent marker on the inside of the collar. Miller, J. The way you mark clothing at boarding school or in the military. His brother's suit, his brother's place, his brother's mess. Caleb took the jacket off the hanger and put it on. He turned to the full-length mirror on the closet door and looked at himself at the shoulders that were slightly broader than Julian's, so. The jacket pulled across the back by a centimeter or two at the hands that emerged from the sleeves, rougher than a financial advisor's hands should be. The knuckles mapped with old work at the face. That was his own face and nobody else's, regardless of what suit he was wearing. I am a ghost, he thought, with a kind of flat, exhausted clarity, living a dead man's life. The fog outside had cleared enough to show him the water. Somewhere out there, beyond the harbor, the ocean continued its work without commentary. He straightened the jacket. He left the mirror. Whatever this house was hiding, and he was increasingly certain it was hiding more than one thing. He was going to have to navigate it without resources, without allies, and without the luxury of walking away. For the first time since he'd gotten into the Escalade, Caleb Miller felt something shift beneath the anxiety. Something older, something the Marine Corps had built in him through methods he hadn't enjoyed and had never stopped being grateful for. He recognized the feeling. He'd had it at the start of operations he couldn't fully see the shape of, when the intelligence was incomplete. And the terrain was unfamiliar and all he had was training and the ability to stay calm long enough to find his footing. The feeling was pay attention. Whatever game was being played inside these glass and marble walls, he had just become a piece on the board. The question was whether he would stay a piece or become something else. He checked his watch, Julian's watch, on his own wrist and went to find the woman he was about to marry. The Rockport Country Club had been founded in 1908 by men who had wanted a place to be themselves without the inconvenience of other people watching. Which was an irony that had not softened with the passage of 117 years. The main hall was a cathedral of dark wood and brass fixtures and oil paintings of Maine coastline, executed with the confident mediocrity of artists who had been paid well and asked few questions. Caleb had been inside the building exactly once before, at 16, when he'd catched a summer job hauling ice from the kitchen. He'd used the service entrance. Today he arrived through the front door as a Sterling. The ceremony itself had been brief to the point of administrative a justice of the peace, who had clearly been briefed on the expectation of efficiency, 2 witnesses Caleb had never seen before and would likely never see again, and Serafina Sterling in an ivory dress that had probably been chosen for her by someone else. She sat in her wheelchair at the end of the aisle, her hands folded in her lap, her expression arranged into something that suggested composure without quite reaching warmth. She was beautiful in a way that seemed beside the point, sharp features, dark eyes. The particular stillness of someone who had learned to control what their face communicated to a room. She looked at him when he reached her. Not through him, not past him. At him. For exactly 3 seconds, something moved behind her eyes, a calculation, or perhaps a recognition, and then it was gone, replaced by the arranged composure. "You're not Julian," she said, very quietly, while the justice of the peace shuffled his papers. "No," Caleb said, "I'm not." She nodded, once, as though he had confirmed something she'd already known. The reception was where things clarified themselves. Eleanor had arranged the room with the precision of someone who understood that social events were a form of communication, and that the message being communicated today was about the restoration of the Sterling family's confidence in its own arrangements. Round tables with centerpieces that cost more than Caleb's monthly rent. An open bar staffed by 2 people in white jackets. A string quartet playing something European and unfailingly tasteful in the corner. Approximately 60 guests, many of whom appeared to know each other from contexts that predated Caleb's existence and would outlast his relevance. Eleanor was at the center of it, moving through the room the way people move through rooms they have furnished for their own performance. She found Caleb within the first 15 minutes, which was not accidental. "Julian," she said, addressing him by the wrong name with a fluency that suggested she had made the decision to call him Julian and was committed to it. She said it in the middle of a small cluster of guests, a couple in their 60s, who had the bearing of board members, and a younger woman who was writing something in a small notebook and was therefore, Caleb gathered, press of some variety. "Julian, come meet the Hendersons." Gordon was on the hospital board with Serafina's father. He let her do it. Once, he moved through the introductions and shook Gordon Henderson's hand and answered the questions about his work, Julian's work, the financial advising, the portfolio management, all of it with the vague generalities of someone who has been coached but not well. The Henderson couple were polite. The woman with the notebook was attentive. The second time Eleanor called him Julian was in front of a larger group, near the bar. She said it with her hand briefly on his arm, that particular gesture of social stewardship, and this time. She added, "Julian has such interesting hands for a financial man, don't you think? You can see he's been putting them to use." She smiled at the calloused palms, at the scar along the base of his right thumb from a transmission repair 6 weeks ago. "We're trying to decide if it's charming or alarming." Light laughter from the cluster. The specific, wool-lubricated laughter of people who have had enough champagne to find pointed things funny. Caleb held the laughter inside his chest where it became something smaller and harder than laughter. He smiled and said nothing, because he had been in situations where saying nothing was the correct tactic, and this was one of them. He found Serafina across the room, near the windows that overlooked the 18th fairway. She was sitting very still, a champagne glass on the table beside her wheelchair, untouched. A woman in her 40s with the specific efficiency of a paid caregiver stood 3 feet behind her, present without being intrusive. Several guests had passed without speaking to Serafina directly, stopping for brief, performed acknowledgments before moving on, the social equivalent of checking a box. Caleb walked to her, not because anyone had directed him to, but because she was the one person in the room who was alone in a way that he recognized from the inside. He picked up the champagne glass and held it toward her. Eleanor appeared at his left shoulder from somewhere. How she moved that quickly, he would not understand until later, and her hand closed around his wrist. "Not hard." "Precisely. She's a porcelain doll, Caleb." The words were quiet, meant only for him. The smile on Eleanor's face did not change, because the smile on Eleanor's face was not connected to what Eleanor's face was actually expressing. "Don't break what you can't afford to replace." She took the glass from his hand and set it back on the table and moved away, and the whole exchange had lasted 4 seconds and had been invisible to everyone in the room, who wasn't paying the kind of attention Caleb was paying. He stood beside Serafina's wheelchair. He didn't sit. He didn't know if sitting would communicate something it shouldn't. From somewhere, a phone, probably, or a tablet, or whatever the current mechanism was for the velocity of social cruelty, the gossip had already arrived. He became aware of it through a specific quality of peripheral attention. The way a cluster of 3 women near the bar had been glancing at something on a screen and then at him in a rhythm that he clocked within 2 minutes. One of them caught him noticing and looked away with the particular quickness of someone who has been caught doing something they intend to continue doing. He found out the content later, from a guest who had the specific social grace of telling him about it directly, in the manner of someone delivering news they believed was useful. A post on the local Nextdoor app, attributed to an account with a botanical-themed username, that included a photograph of Caleb taken, apparently at the ceremony, hands visible, suit slightly too broad across the shoulders, along with text that described him, among other things, as a white trash gold digger who had sold his soul for a wheelchair-bound fortune. He read it on the borrowed phone and handed it back without comment. The quartet shifted into something that might have been Vivaldi. The bar remained open. Eleanor moved through the room like a current. Caleb stood beside his wife, who was not looking at him, and looked at his own reflection in the darkening window fog. Returning early off the water, swallowing the fairway. The suit pulled across his shoulders. His hands hung at his sides, the way hands do when there is nothing useful for them to do. And then he noticed it. He had turned back toward Serafina not for any particular reason. Just the restlessness of a man who needed to look at something real, and he saw her hand on the armrest of her wheelchair. Not the loose, slightly curved position of a hand at rest. Not the tremor of a neurological symptom. A deliberate, rhythmic motion. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause. Like a signal, or like the physical expression of a mind working steadily and privately beneath a composed surface, maintaining its own rhythm while the room around it performed its various functions. He watched it for several seconds without moving. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps. Who are you? He thought, not with suspicion, exactly. With something more like the beginning of an entirely different question than the ones he'd arrived with. The Vivaldi continued. Eleanor laughed at something across the room, her voice carrying the confident projection of someone accustomed to being the most important person present. Caleb looked at the tapping hand, and then at Serafina's profile, the jaw set, the eyes forward. The expression arranged and held, and he felt the specific quality of attention that had kept him alive in environments where everything on the surface was one thing and everything underneath was another. Something in this room was not what it was presenting itself as. He didn't know yet what that meant, but he was going to find out. The house settled into itself after midnight the way large houses do, the particular language of cooling wood and contracting metal, the small, private sounds of a structure returning to its own silence after the performance of occupation. Caleb had been awake for 19 hours. He didn't try to sleep. The bridal suite had been presented to him as a shared space, which he had understood immediately as another of Eleanor's arrangements, an arrangement designed for the appearance of a marriage rather than the reality of one. In practice, the suite was divided by an antechamber with a daybed that had clearly been prepared for him and a primary bedroom that was Serafina's, separated by a door that she had closed without comment when they'd returned from the country club at 10. The sound of the CPAP machine came through the door at a steady, measured rhythm. He could hear it from the daybed. He sat on the floor instead. The carpet was thick enough that this was not uncomfortable, exactly, but the discomfort wasn't the point. He sat on the floor because sitting on the floor in a furnished room was something he'd learned to do when he needed his body to remember what actual conditions felt like, when the surrounding environment was too constructed, too managed, too far from anything he trusted. He opened his banking app. The number that appeared was $0. Not overdrawn. Not negative. 0. The specific, institutional 0 of an account that had been administratively frozen pending investigation, the kind of 0 that meant there was technically money somewhere that technically had his name on it. But that money had been suspended in a legal process that would take, according to the attorney's letter, a minimum of 6 to 18 months to resolve. He closed the app. He opened his email. He closed his email. He put the phone face down on the carpet beside him. He thought about what he needed to think about, which was Julian's old files. before leaving the house on Elm Street before the escalade, and the fog and the glass and marble he had taken, almost by reflex, the folder Julian had left in the hall closet. It was a habit from childhood clean up what Julian left behind. The folder had felt light, which should have been a sign. He'd put it in his bag without looking at it, the way you close a drawer before you've decided whether you want to see what's inside. He opened the bag and found the folder. The reverse mortgage application was the first thing he saw. His parents' address, printed in the header. His parents' names in the applicant fields. His father's signature or something that was intended to appear as his father's signature at the bottom, dated 14 months ago. Caleb held the document and read it twice. Then he held it and did not read it, just held it in both hands, because sometimes you need a moment between the information and the response. Julian had initiated a reverse mortgage application against their parents' home. Not a HELOC. The family had the HELOC because they needed the money after Julian stopped contributing to household expenses. And their father's knee surgery had consumed the emergency fund. The reverse mortgage was different. The reverse mortgage was a plan to convert the home's equity into cash that would have gone somewhere. To whom, and for what purpose, was not specified in the application's incomplete paperwork. Because Julian had never completed it. Because something had interrupted that plan before it reached the closing stage. The crash, the SEC investigation, the flight. Julian had been planning to sell their parents' home without telling them. He had been attempting to forge their father's signature to do it. I sold myself, Caleb said quietly, to the darkroom, for a brother who never loved me. He heard his own voice say it and was surprised by how steady it sounded. The steadiness wasn't composure. It was something past composure, the other side of it, where the shock has run its course and left a flatness behind that is neither numb nor feeling but simply a cleared space where things are. He set the application on the floor beside the phone. He'd cataloged his situation with the same systematic attention. He'd applied to hostile environments, because that was the only methodology he trusted under pressure. His bank accounts were frozen. He had no access to money. His parents' home was 60 days from foreclosure on a HELOC balance his brother's debts had precipitated. His brother had also attempted, separately, to extract the equity from that home through fraud. He had signed a contract in that kitchen 3 days ago. No, this morning, 14 hours ago. Though it felt like 3 days that forgave Julian's $2.3 million debt in exchange for this marriage. He was sitting on the floor of a bridal suite in a glass and marble house that belonged to a family he did not know. Surrounded by surveillance he had identified but not fully mapped, next to a woman he had exchanged 11 words with. He had no allies, no resources, no exit. He was 34 years old and he was completely, architecturally alone. The CPAP machine continued its rhythm through the closed door. Steady, mechanical, indifferent. He picked up Julian's old folder again, looking for something else. He wasn't sure what, only that there was a habit of thoroughness that he couldn't turn off, and he found the prescription receipts at the bottom. 3 of them, all from the same main pharmacy, all dating from the period 2 years ago, when Julian had apparently been managing Serafina's household accounts as part of his advisory relationship with the family. The prescriptions were for a sedative compound that Caleb didn't recognize by name. But he recognized the category. He'd seen it in the documentation for a veteran he'd helped navigate the VA system 2 years back. Benzodiazepine class, controlled substance, prescribed not to Julian but to a patient identified only by initials. S.E.S. He sat with that for a moment. Serafina Eleanor Sterling. He thought about the ring camera in the corridor. He thought about the power of attorney. He thought about the way Eleanor had said, "My daughter's situation is not slow." The particular emphasis on slow, as though slowness was a quality she had engineered and wished to accelerate. He thought about the tapping hand on the wheelchair's armrest. 3 taps. Pause. He thought about Serafina's eyes at the ceremony, when she looked at him for exactly 3 seconds and said, with complete calmness, "You're not Julian." The CPAP machine breathed through the door. He looked at the pill organizer on the nightstand. He'd noticed it when they'd first arrived. The kind of thing you notice when you're cataloging a room. Weekly compartments, evening doses, the same sedative category. Whoever was filling that organizer, it wasn't Serafina choosing her own medications. It was someone with a power of attorney who had full authority over her medical decisions. The weight of it assembled itself slowly, the way weight does. When the individual components are each too manageable on their own but accumulate into something structural. Julian had stolen $2.3 million from the Sterling Family Trust. Julian had also separately been present in this household, had known Serafina, had known about her medical situation, had known about the medications. Caleb pressed his back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was high and white and offered no assistance. He thought about what Julian had said, in that hospital room he had visited 2 years ago. He didn't have the memory fully yet, it was coming up in fragments, the way memories do when the mind starts connecting what it previously kept separate. Julian had been frantic about something. A timeline, a document. Caleb had been distracted by his own circumstances and had listened with half his attention, the way you do with someone who is often in some kind of crisis. The shape of it was beginning to come clear, and the shape was worse than anything he'd speculated about on the drive from Elm Street. He sat on the floor of the bridal suite with his back against the wall and Julian's documents in his hands. And he understood, with the cold, particular clarity that exhaustion sometimes produces, that he had not walked into a rescue. He had not come to save his parents' home by marrying into a complicated family. He had walked into the aftermath of something that had not finished happening. And Serafina Sterling, sleeping in the next room with a CPAP machine breathing for her and a pill organizer on her nightstand filled with someone else's prescriptions, was not the problem. She was the target. He was still sitting on the floor, very still, when the first gray light appeared at the edge of the curtains. He had not slept. He did not particularly feel the lack of it. He put Julian's documents back in the folder. He put the folder back in his bag. He sat with his knees drawn up and his hands resting on top of them. And he breathed with the deliberate steadiness of someone who has decided what kind of person they're going to be in the situation they're currently in. He was the miller who stayed. He was the miller who fixed things. He was, as it turned out, the only miller left who was still here. That would have to be enough to start with. Friends, what a story we have on our hands. Caleb walked into the Sterling estate thinking the worst was already behind him, a forced marriage, a brother's debt, his parents' home on the line. But what he's finding inside those glass and marble walls is something far darker. A power of attorney that hands one woman total control over another. A camera watching a bride's every move. And medications in a pill organizer that nobody chose for themselves. Caleb came here to be the spare the brother left behind to clean up a mess he didn't make. But something tells me the real story is just getting started. Stay with us, friends. Because the woman in that wheelchair? She's been waiting. And she's been preparing. Don't go anywhere. The hospital had smelled the way hospitals always smell. Antiseptic over something organic and unwilling. The combination that the body registers before the mind catches up. Caleb had driven up from Rockport in a borrowed truck on a Tuesday in October, 2 years ago, because Julian had called him 3 times in 2 hours. Which was unusual enough to override his better judgment. He found Julian in the waiting room of Maine Medical Center, not admitted, not injured, just sitting in a plastic chair with his coat still on, his phone in both hands. His knee moving with the specific velocity of a man whose adrenaline has nowhere useful to go. You came, Julian said. You called 3 times. I need you to listen to something and not ask questions until I'm finished. This was, in retrospect, the sentence that Caleb should have walked away from. He had not walked away from it, because Julian was his brother. And because not walking away was the thing Caleb did in situations that required someone to stay. What Julian told him, in compressed fragments over the next 20 minutes, was this: there had been a car. There had been an arrangement he'd made with a mechanic, not Caleb, someone else, someone who owed Julian a favor involving the brake system of a vehicle. The intention had been to create a scare, a minor incident, enough for Serafina to feel vulnerable, to feel that she needed someone managing her affairs. More actively, to be willing to sign a document authorizing expanded control over her trust distributions. The plan had gone wrong. The road had been wet. The speed had been higher than anyone had intended. Serafina had not been frightened into signing. Serafina had been put into surgery. Julian, at the scene when the ambulance arrived, had made the decision to leave. Caleb had sat with his brother in that waiting room and heard this and said nothing for a long time. He'd looked at the floor, at the other people in the waiting room, all of them there for different reasons, all of them carrying something. He'd looked at Julian's hands, which were trembling finely. He had not asked the questions he should have asked. He had not said the things he should have said. He had existed, in that moment, in the particular paralysis of a person who loves someone they are also beginning to understand they should not protect. He had gone home. He had told himself Julian would handle it. He had told himself it wasn't as bad as it sounded. That was the lie he'd chosen. He understood that now, sitting on the daybed in the Sterling Estates bridal suite as the morning assembled itself outside the curtains. He thought about the pill organizer. He thought about the sedatives. He thought about the prescription receipts in Julian's folder, the initials S. E. S. The dates that overlapped precisely with the period Julian had been managing the household accounts. The accident had been a failed attempt at control. When control through fear hadn't worked, when it had gone catastrophically wrong, someone else had stepped into the space that fear was supposed to occupy. Eleanor Sterling, with her power of attorney and her ring camera, and her full authority over medical decisions, had arrived in that space like water filling a depression. And the sedatives in the pill organizer were how you kept someone in a wheelchair who might otherwise be capable of getting out of it. Caleb stood up from the daybed. He moved to the window and looked at the coastal morning, the water the color of pewter. The trees along the property's edge holding their last October color, red and gold in the gray light. He thought about Serafina's hand on the armrest. 3 taps, pause, the deliberate rhythm of a mind working underneath everything else, keeping its own count. She's been documenting, he thought. He didn't know how he knew it, only that it aligned with what her eyes had communicated at the ceremony, that flash of calculation, 3 seconds, gone. A woman who had been managing something very carefully for a very long time. He was the spare, the one who fixed what others broke, the one who cleaned up after Julian without ever once asking Julian to clean up after himself, without ever once choosing his own life over the accommodation of someone else's mess. He looked at his hands. The grease was scrubbed clean for the wedding, but the calluses remained, permanent, the record of every hour of actual work. The Marine Corps had built his hands into instruments. The years at the garage had kept them that way. He had walked into this house with nothing. No money, no leverage, no plan, but he was beginning to understand what the plan needed to be. He was the only person in this house who knew what Julian had done. He was the only person in this house who had arrived without an existing arrangement, without an agenda he'd been managing for years. He was the only person in this house who had no investment in the current situation continuing. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the only kind of freedom available to him, and he was going to have to use it. He dressed quietly. He went to the door that connected to Serafina's room and listened. The CPAP had gone quiet at some point in the early morning. The silence behind the door was a different quality than the silence of sleep. He knew what he needed to do next. He was going to wait for nightfall to do it. The day passed in the way days pass inside houses that are performing a function, meals served at intervals, staff moving through corridors on established routes, Eleanor appearing at specific times with the scheduled quality of a person who has organized their presence into a management system. Caleb played the part that was expected of him, which was the part of a man who was grateful and slightly out of his depth. Because that was close enough to the truth to be sustainable and different enough from what was actually happening inside him to constitute cover. He ate lunch in the dining room with Eleanor and a man named Aldrich, who appeared to be some variety of a state attorney and who asked Caleb questions about Julian's work with the easy familiarity of someone who had known Julian and was recalibrating in real time. Caleb answered carefully, staying general, watching Aldrich's eyes for the specific movement. That meant he'd said something inconsistent with the Julian that Aldrich remembered. Aldrich's eyes didn't move in that direction, which meant either Aldrich hadn't known Julian as well as his familiarity suggested, or Julian had been as vague with Aldrich as Caleb was being now. Both possibilities were informative. Serafina had not appeared for lunch. She tires easily, Eleanor said, addressing Caleb's glance toward the empty chair. The physical demands of yesterday. We don't push her, of course, Caleb said. She'll be better tomorrow, I'm sure. He spent the afternoon moving through the visible spaces of the estate, with the specific purposefulness of someone being newly domestic, finding where things were, asking staff members small questions about household routines, establishing the baseline of what normal looked like so he could identify deviations from it. 3 members of staff, 1 caregiver, the woman from the reception, whose name was Donna, 2 others who managed the house itself. None of them, as far as he could determine, were positioned as surveillance. They were employees doing their jobs, and their jobs were not to watch him. The ring camera in the corridor was watching him. He made note of its angle each time he passed, and adjusted his routes through the 2nd floor accordingly. By 4 in the afternoon, he had developed a working map of the house's rhythms. Eleanor's office was on the ground floor, east wing. She was in it from 2 to 6, after which she had a standing phone call that occupied her until dinner. The estate's main security system was managed remotely. The monitoring station was off-site, which meant the local camera feeds were accessible through a networked hub somewhere in the house, likely the utility room adjacent to the kitchen. The ring camera in Serafina's corridor fed to a device elsewhere, either Eleanor's phone or a separate tablet, and was not part of the house system. He went to the kitchen at 4:30 and asked one of the staff, a quiet man named Carlos, if there was anywhere on the property he could do some basic maintenance work. He'd noticed a gate hinge on the south wall that looked like it needed attention. It was the kind of question that established him as someone who did things with his hands, and who had already been here long enough to notice small problems, which was the portrait of a man settling in. Carlos told him there was a tool shed near the east garden wall. The tool shed contained exactly what a tool shed on an estate like this should contain: organized, well maintained, the tools of a property that was managed with professional consistency. Caleb spent 40 minutes there. He found what he needed and didn't take it, not yet. He noted where it was. He repaired the gate hinge, because he'd said he would, and because doing exactly what you say you're going to do is the foundation of appearing predictable to people who are watching you. He was back in the suite by 6. He sat in the chair by the balcony doors and waited. He was good at waiting. The Marines had trained him for it, and the garage had reinforced it. The particular productive patience of someone who understands that timing is not separate from competence but is, in fact, most of competence. At 11:30, Eleanor's light went out. He could see it from the balcony, her office window. 1st floor, east wing. The last lit window on that side of the house. At midnight, the staff building's windows went dark. At 1:15, the house's ambient sounds completed their nightly downshift into the specific quiet of a structure whose human inhabitants had stopped moving. He stood up from the chair. He moved without turning on lights. His eyes had been adjusting for the past hour. Deliberately, the way you manage your night vision when you know you're going to need it. He went to his bag and retrieved the folder. He took out the prescription receipts and Julian's 401k notice and the reverse mortgage application. He photographed each one with his phone, backing up to a cloud account he was reasonably certain wasn't connected to anything that could be frozen. He opened his phone to the SEC's public whistleblower portal and navigated it until he understood what reporting an ongoing securities fraud required. He didn't file anything yet. He built the architecture of what he would need to file, organized it in a note, and saved it. He thought about Serafina's files. Whatever she'd been collecting on Eleanor's embezzlement, and he was increasingly certain the collection existed. Had to exist, because the tapping hand was not the hand of someone who had been waiting passively. Those files were somewhere in the estate. In the safe he hadn't seen yet. In a device he hadn't identified. Behind the wall she walked to, in the sequence of events he didn't know yet, but was beginning to anticipate with a precision that felt like knowledge rather than speculation. He couldn't get to those files yet. He needed her trust for that, and trust required something he hadn't yet offered. What he could do tonight was position himself, leave himself available to be found. He went to the armchair in the corner of the bridal suite's antechamber, the one positioned at an angle that faced both the balcony door and the primary bedroom door. And he sat there in the dark with his hands loose on the armrests and the specific alert stillness he'd carried home from Kandahar. He waited. At 2 in the morning, he heard the CPAP machine click off. The sound was small, the absence of a sound. Really, the machine finishing its cycle and not resuming. He stayed completely still. For 30 seconds, nothing. Then the sound of sheets. A careful, deliberate movement. Then silence that had a different quality than before, the silence of someone awake and moving with precision rather than the silence of someone asleep. He sat in the dark chair and breathed and let his hands stay loose on the armrests. And he watched the thin line of light at the bottom of the bedroom door disappear as someone moved in front of it. The door handle turned. The bedroom was bathed in the particular blue of Maine coastal moonlight, not warm, not cold, but the specific silver blue of light that has traveled across open water and carries something of the water's quality with it. It came through the shears at the windows in the way light moves when there is no human source competing with it. Touching everything it reached with the same impartial clarity. Caleb watched from the armchair. Serafina Sterling stood. She did it the way people stand who have been standing all along in private, without the drama of an effort, without the careful management of a difficult action. With the simple, unremarkable economy of a body doing what bodies do. Her hands left the bed. Her feet found the floor. She rose to her full height. She was perhaps 5'6", slender in the way of people who are careful about everything they do. And she stood in the moonlight of her own bedroom with her eyes open and her expression the same composed, watchful quality he'd seen at the ceremony. She did not reach for the wheelchair. She crossed the room with steps that were precise and quiet, her feet finding the path between the furniture with the confidence of someone who had walked this route many times in the dark. She went to the far wall, the wall that, from his position in the antechamber doorway, appeared to be simple paneling, the kind of detail you stop seeing once it becomes background, and she pressed something he couldn't see, and a section of the wall moved inward 3 inches, and she opened it the rest of the way with both hands. A safe, recessed into the wall behind the panel. A fireproof document safe the size of a large suitcase. The kind that required a combination and a key, both of which she provided with the ease of someone who has repeated an action until the movements are no longer conscious. The safe was full. He could see, from where he stood, the stacks of folders, the hard drives, the specific organized density of material that someone has been compiling for a long time with a system. She reached inside. She removed a folder and a small external drive. Caleb stepped out of the doorway. He had made a decision, somewhere in the previous hour of sitting in the dark, about how to do this. Not with noise, not with drama, not with the kind of announcement that produces defense rather than conversation. He simply stepped into the moonlight where she could see him. Serafina did not scream. She did not drop the folder. She turned, in one smooth motion, and looked at him with the expression of someone who has assessed a situation and arrived at a conclusion within the same moment. "You can walk," he said. It was not an accusation. It was not a question. He said it the way you state something you're relieved is true. She looked at him for 2 seconds. Then, "And you're not the coward, Julian." She said it with the particular calm of someone delivering an assessment they've had time to verify. "I've been waiting for the spare to wake up." He crossed to the chair nearest the window, not near her, not crowding her, and sat. She remained standing. The moonlight moved between them. How long? He asked. The legs? She considered it without apparent emotion. 6 months after the accident. The damage was real, the nerve compression was real. But the recovery was further along than Eleanor's doctors were reporting, because Eleanor's doctors were Eleanor's doctors. She glanced at the pill organizer on the nightstand. The sedatives helped keep the timeline where she needed it. The CPAP machine covers the sound of getting up. A brief pause. I've been managing the dosage. What she thinks I'm taking and what I'm actually taking are not the same. He nodded. The safe. 2 years of Eleanor's fund distributions. The discrepancies in the Sterling Trust accounts. Wire transfers to 3 accounts in her name in the Caymans and 1 in Jersey. She set the folder on the chair beside her without sitting in it. Your brother took 2.3 million. Eleanor has taken 11. The number settled into the room. Why the marriage? He asked. Because a wife has standing that a stepdaughter under a POA doesn't. She looked at him directly, with the specific attention of someone who wants to make sure they're being understood. I needed a Miller. Julian was supposed to be frightened into it. Eleanor's leverage, her design, not mine. When Julian fled, she pivoted. She needed the marriage to happen regardless. I needed it to happen for different reasons. You knew I wasn't Julian. I knew Julian. You walked differently. Something crossed her face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. Julian walked like someone performing competence. You walked like someone who actually had it. He sat with that for a moment. What do you need from me? He asked. She opened the folder. Inside printed financial records, annotated in a hand that was precise and dense. Dates, account numbers, transfer amounts, a timeline spanning 26 months. A witness, she said. Someone with standing who isn't on Eleanor's payroll. And someone who can walk into that boardroom without flinching. The Sterling Group's board meeting had been scheduled for 3 days hence. A quarterly asset review that Eleanor had arranged, at which she would execute the final phase of a trust restructuring she'd been engineering for 14 months. The restructuring, if completed, would transfer the primary Sterling assets into a holding structure that would, in effect, make Eleanor's control permanent and Serafina's claims against the trust procedurally inaccessible. They spent 2 hours at the window with Serafina's documents spread between them. Working through it the way you work through a technical problem systematically, without emotion, because the emotion could come later when there was room for it. The SEC whistleblower filing he'd already drafted needed 3 additional documents. She had them. The Medicare fraud. Eleanor had been billing Serafina's care expenses through a structure that fraudulently classified her as a dependent, requiring full-time medical management. Collecting reimbursements for treatments Serafina neither needed nor received required a separate filing with HHS. The POA itself was challengeable on grounds that she had been medicated below capacity at the time of its execution. And Serafina had, over the past 18 months, quietly assembled the medical records, dosage logs, and physician communications that would support that challenge. She had done all of this from a wheelchair, in a room with a camera watching her door, with Eleanor. Managing her medical care and her finances and her daily schedule, for 2 years. You could have gone to the police, Caleb said, not as a criticism. Eleanor has 3 friends on the Rockport Police Department's board and a former DA who golfs with her husband twice a month. Serafina's voice was even. I needed federal. I needed documentation sufficient that local interference couldn't touch it. And I needed someone who wasn't already inside Eleanor's network. She looked at him. You're not inside her network, she said. No, he agreed. I'm not. The boardroom occupied the estate's ground floor east wing, adjacent to Eleanor's office. At 10 in the morning, with a thin November light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Eleanor Sterling sat at the head of the table with Aldridge. The attorney on her left and 2 board members Caleb recognized from the reception on her right. The final asset transfer documents were on the table. Eleanor had a pen in her hand. Caleb walked in through the main door. He was wearing the same charcoal suit, but he had taken Julian's name off the collar with a razor. Small thing. irrelevant to everyone in the room but him. He set the SEC audit notice on the table printed from the whistleblower confirmation that had arrived at 6:15 that morning. 22 minutes after he'd submitted the filing with Serafina's documentation attached. He set the HHS Medicare fraud report beside it. He set a printed summary of the trust discrepancies, Serafina's 2-year compilation, in the center of the table where everyone at it could see the numbers. Eleanor looked at the documents. Her expression did not change, but her hand, the one with the pen, went very still. Julian stole the money, Eleanor, Caleb said. But you stole her life. The government is very interested in where the Sterling Trust actually went. He stepped to his left. Serafina walked through the door. She walked the way she had walked across her bedroom in the moonlight, with precision, without drama. With the steady economy of someone who has been walking all along and is simply now doing it in front of an audience. The room went completely silent. The board members looked at her. Aldrich looked at her. Eleanor looked at her with the specific, arrested attention of someone whose most important calculation has just been invalidated. Today, Serafina said, from the doorway, her voice carrying into a room that had no competing sounds to manage, the law finally sees what you tried to bury in a wheelchair. She crossed to the table and stood beside Caleb. She did not look at Eleanor again. She looked at the board members, at the two men who had fiduciary responsibilities. They had been, apparently, failing to exercise, and she let the silence do the work that silence does when the documents on the table are sufficient. Eleanor Sterling set her pen down. Outside, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Atlantic was flat and gray and patient and very large. November on the Maine coast has a particular quality that the other months don't, a specific clarity of light and air that comes after the tourist season has ended. And before the winter has fully committed. A brief window when the coastline belongs only to itself and to the people who have chosen to stay. The lobster boats were back in the harbor, their work being the work of staying rather than departing. The trees along Elm Street had surrendered their color and stood bare and uncomplaining against a sky the shade of old pewter. The mortgage papers were on the kitchen table, paid in full, 2 words that, in combination, performed a small miracle on the atmosphere of a room that had contained, for the better part of a year, a specific quality of dread, the weight of a debt that had arrived through no fault of the people responsible for carrying it. Frank Miller had read the papers 3 times. He was 64 years old and had worked with his hands for 41 of those years. And the arthritic knee that had ended his time at the boatyard had not ended his ability to understand what those words meant, had not ended the particular expression he wore as he set the papers down on the table and looked at his son for a long moment without speaking. Rosemary Miller had cried, briefly and privately, in the kitchen. Then she had made coffee and set it out on the porch, because that was what you did with things that were too large to address directly. The HELOC was cleared. The HELOC was cleared because the Sterling Trust's legal restructuring completed under a court-supervised process that had begun the morning Serafina walked into the boardroom, had restored Serafina's direct control over her assets, and Serafina had chosen, as one of her first acts of restored authority, to satisfy Julian's debt in full, and to additionally ensure that the Miller family's home was free from the consequences of a debt they had inherited rather than incurred. Julian was in custody. The Swiss authorities had cooperated. International financial fraud creates a particular kind of efficiency in these matters. A shared professional interest in the outcome, and he was being extradited to face charges that included embezzlement, securities fraud, and a count related to the auto accident that Caleb's testimony, combined with the records from the investigation, had been sufficient to support. The mechanic who had done the brake work had cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced charge. Julian, according to his attorney's public statement, intended to contest the extradition. Julian's intentions regarding extradition were no longer something Caleb spent time on. Eleanor Sterling had been arrested 18 days after the boardroom meeting, on federal charges that included wire fraud, Medicare fraud, and a charge of financial elder abuse. The latter applied because Serafina had been, under Eleanor's POA regime, systematically exploited in a manner that met the statutory definition regardless of Eleanor's relationship to her. Eleanor had posted bail and was living in a condominium in Portland while her attorney prepared a defense that, according to the public record, relied substantially on the argument that she had acted in what she believed were Serafina's best interests. The $11 million in the Cayman and Jersey accounts was going to make that argument difficult to sustain. The POA had been revoked by the court within 72 hours of the filing, on the basis of the medical documentation Serafina had assembled, the sedative logs, the physician communications, the records showing that her neurological progress had been actively misrepresented to keep her classified as requiring full-time management. Her own attorney, whom she had retained 2 years prior, paying the retainer from a small account Eleanor hadn't known existed, had been waiting for exactly this moment. She was methodical, Serafina Sterling. She was the most methodical person Caleb had ever worked alongside, which was a category that included his platoon sergeant, who had once organized a forward operating base with the precision of a person who genuinely enjoyed the process. He sat beside her on the porch of his parents' house and looked at the harbor. They had arrived separately. She had driven up from the estate in the car she'd purchased the week after the boardroom meeting, a practical thing, a Subaru Forester in a quiet gray. The first car she had chosen entirely for herself in 3 years. He had driven up in his truck. They had eaten his mother's pot roast, which was the thing his mother did with moments that required acknowledgement, but were too large for words. And now they were sitting on the porch in the November light with coffee cups and the paid-in-full papers on the table between them and the harbor below. "Your security firm," Serafina said. She was watching the boats. "Tell me what you're thinking." He had told her the outline 2 weeks ago, over the course of several conversations. That had the quality of conversations between people who are still figuring out what they are to each other but have agreed, in the meantime, to be useful. A private security and asset protection firm. Not the kind that provided bodyguards to people with inflated threat assessments, but the kind that identified structural vulnerabilities in estate planning and financial management. The gaps that allowed what had happened to Serafina to happen. The places where legal frameworks created opportunities for people like Eleanor. He knew the financial side imperfectly. He knew the security and investigative side with the precision of someone who had been trained for it, and had just spent 6 weeks applying it in conditions that were, in their own way, as high stakes as anything he'd encountered in uniform. She knew the financial side the way only someone who had spent 2 years documenting her own exploitation could know it, with the granular, architectural understanding of someone who had mapped every mechanism. "I think we should call it Sterling Miller," she said, which was not what he'd expected, and he turned to look at her. She was still watching the harbor. There was something in her profile that was not the composed, managed expression of the country club or the boardroom. Something that looked like what a person looks like when they are no longer performing any version of themselves for any audience. "Sterling Miller," he said. "In that order," she said. "Alphabetical." He looked back at the harbor. The lobster boats rocked at their moorings. The light on the water was the particular silver of a late November morning. He thought about the watch. He'd returned it to Julian's room when he'd gone back to the house on Elm Street to collect his things. Set it on the nightstand where it had been, and left it there. It was Julian's watch. It had always been Julian's watch. The weight of it in his palm had been borrowed, not his. He thought about the suit, still at the Sterling estate in the closet he'd stopped using. The suit with Miller, J. written on the collar in permanent marker. He wasn't going to need that suit. He had his own name. He had had it the whole time. He had simply been, for a long stretch of years, in situations that asked him to subordinate it. The foreclosure notice was gone from the table. The final notices were gone. What remained was the paid-in-full stamp and 2 cups of coffee and the sound of his mother moving in the kitchen and the harbor below them doing the work it had always done. He thought about what Serafina had said at the ceremony, when she'd looked at him for 3 seconds with that particular quality of attention and said, "You're not Julian." He thought about what it had meant at the time, just an observation. Now, retroactively, it seemed like the most important thing anyone had said to him in years. Not Julian, not the spare, not the brother who stayed and fixed and cleaned up and absorbed. Himself. At 34, he understood something that had taken the particular form of the past 6 weeks to teach him. That being the one who stayed wasn't a failure of ambition. It was a kind of structural strength that only reveals itself when everything else has broken and something has to hold the weight. He had held the weight. He was still holding it. The difference now was that the weight was his own life, chosen, rather than someone else's life handed to him by default. Sterling Miller, he said again. Unless you object, she said. I don't object. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. The harbor was doing what the harbor does. Later, not today. There was time. There was now somehow the specific luxury of time. He would sign the incorporation papers with his own name. The ink would sit clean on the page, black on white, the way it looks when there is no debt attached to it. No obligation. No brother's ghost in the collar of the suit. Just his name. Just that. For the first time in his life, Caleb Miller was the only version of himself there was. Friends, how did you find today's story? Caleb Miller came into this thing with nothing. No money. No plan. No idea what he was walking into. He came because his parents needed him, and he stayed because that's who he was. The spare. The one who fixed what others broke. The one who never left. And Serafina Sterling, she had spent 2 years building something in the dark, in a wheelchair, in a room with a camera watching her door. She had been sedated and surveilled and controlled by someone who had looked at her life and decided it was an asset to be managed. And she had taken all of that, every single day of it, and turned it into documentation. Into evidence. Into a case. She had been so much more than anyone had allowed her to appear. There is something in that, friends, that I want to sit with for a moment. We talk a lot about strength, about standing up, about fighting back, and all of that is real and all of that matters. But Serafina's strength was a different kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that keeps its own count in the dark. The kind that waits, not from fear, but from the understanding that timing is everything and the right moment is worth all the ones that came before. And Caleb's strength was the kind that most people never get credit for. The strength of being reliable, of being present, of being the person who shows up when everyone else has already decided the situation is someone else's problem. The world needs both kinds of people. The ones who document, the ones who hold the weight, the ones who recognize each other across a room, across a ceremony, across a contract signed under duress, and decide, without much discussion, to try. I hope this story brought you something today, friends. Maybe it was the satisfaction of seeing things put right. Maybe it was the reminder that what you carry quietly, over time, is not invisible, it accumulates, and one day it becomes exactly what the moment requires. Maybe it was simply the reminder that being the one who stays is not the lesser choice. It never was. Thank you for being here with me today. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone, or of yourself, leave me a comment. I read every one. And please, subscribe and hit that like button. It means everything, and it helps me bring you more stories like this one. Until next time, friends, take good care.